They didn't just burn my firewood, they burned my lifeline. In the dead of Montana winter, with a storm rolling in and temperatures set to plunge below zero, the HOA decided my winter stockpile was too unsightly. So they destroyed it, just like that. No warning, no remorse. I stood in the ash of everything I'd spent months preparing, holding my daughter's hand, as she shivered inside a house growing colder by the hour. They called it a violation. I called it sabotage. And when they told me to keep quiet and play by their rules, I walked to the old hatch at the edge of my land, the one my grandfather built before any HOA ever existed, and I opened the spillway. Because some people only understand consequences when the flood finally reaches their doorstep. Winter in this corner of Montana doesn't arrive. It invades. It slams in like an armored column, no warning shots, no quarter given. By mid-October, the wind already carries the smell of iron and pine needles frozen mid-fall. The cold doesn't creep. It punches straight through wool and skin and bone until your thoughts themselves feel brittle. Out here, the mountains don't care how many tours you've done or how many medals they pinned on your chest. When the temperature drops hard enough, every man is just meat trying not to freeze. I learned that long before I ever bought this place. After 22 years of carrying a rifle for uncles who never learned my first name, I came home with a duffel, a medical discharge, and a daughter who needed somewhere the sky didn't explode at night. I found it in a narrow valley 30 minutes outside Helena, a patch of land pressed against a ridge so steep the sun gives up and goes home by 3 p.m. in December. The cabin was small, honest, built in the 60s by people who still believed a man ought to be able to see weather coming from his own porch. The deed was older still, inked in 1957, carrying a clause nobody had paid attention to in 3 generations, full ownership and maintenance rights to the emergency spillway and the manual gate that fed the reservoir above the neighborhood. My grandfather had poured the concrete himself. His handwriting was still scratched into the wet mix near the valve wheel J. Harlan, 57. I ran my thumb over those letters the day the realtor handed me the keys and felt something settle inside my chest that hadn't settled since Kandahar. I started preparing the way other men start gardens. August heat still shimmered off the gravel when I fired up the chainsaw and dropped the first stand of birch. The smell of fresh sap and 2-stroke exhaust hung thick while I bucked logs into rounds and split them with a 16-pound maul that sang every time it bit wood. By the end of the month, I had 4 cords stacked in perfect rows along the back fence walls of split maple and birch rising like ramparts. I built the shed with my own hands, 10 by 16 double-walled roof trusses, heavy enough to laugh at wet snow. Inside went the backup propane tank in a steel cage I welded myself, mouse-proof, bear-proof, idiot-proof. Pallets of canned goods lined the shelves in neat military rows. Chili beans, peaches, tuna-powdered eggs, anything that would sit for 5 years and still feed a growing girl. I added 50-pound sacks of rice, salt flour, oats, coffee. When the grid failed, and it always failed, we would not be the family eating wallpaper paste. My neighbors watched from their triple-pane windows and pretended they didn't see. Most of them had moved here for the view and the covenants, the promise that nothing would ever look unprepared. They paid other people to plow their driveways and trusted satellites to keep their heat pumps humming. A few waved when I hauled logs past their mailboxes. Most looked away. And then there was the HOA. The first time Karen Stratton rolled up my driveway, the afternoon light was the color of weak tea, and the air already carried the promise of snow. Her white Escalade gleamed like it had never seen mud. Vanity plate Ridge 1. Blonde bob sharp enough to cut glass sunglasses, reflecting my woodpile back at me like an accusation. She lowered the window exactly 4 inches, the official HOA greeting distance, and smiled with the confidence of a woman who had never once been told no and meant it. Mr. Harlan, she called, voice bright, and practiced the same tone officers use right before they explain why your leave is canceled. We've had several residents express concern about the volume of your outdoor storage. I leaned the splitting maul against the chopping block and wiped sawdust from my forearms. It's firewood, ma'am. Keeps my daughter from turning into an icicle when the power lines snap, which they do. Every single winter. Her smile stayed pinned in place, but the corners tightened the way a sniper's cheek welds to the stock. Of course, safety is everyone's priority. It's simply that the quantity appears to exceed the allowances outlined in our Visual Harmony and Architectural Standards Section 4C. I let the silence stretch just long enough for the wind to rattle the aspen leaves behind me. Section 4C, I repeated. The one that doesn't actually exist in the copy of the covenants I printed off the county website last week. A flicker, something between irritation and surprise, crossed her face before the mask slid back into place. We're updating the language this quarter. In the meantime, I'm sure you want to be a good neighbor. I looked past her at the perfect rows of split birch gleaming gold in the low sun, then back at her French manicure wrapped around a leather steering wheel cover. Ma'am, my daughter and I plan to be alive in February. That's the only kind of neighbor I'm interested in being. She blinked once slow. I'll leave the formal notice with you then. We do hope you'll reconsider before the matter has to escalate. The envelope appeared between two manicured fingers like a white flag in reverse. I took it without reading, folded it once, and tucked it into my back pocket the way I used to tuck frag orders I already knew were bullshit. Karen raised the window, executed a perfect three-point turn, and rolled away down the gravel without raising a single speck of dust. I watched the Escalade disappear around the bend, then turned back to the woodpile. 3 days later, the second notice arrived, this time taped to my front door in a plastic sleeve like a restaurant menu. Red border, bold capitals. Violation, immediate removal required. I photographed it, time-stamped it, filed it in the folder already growing fat on my desk. Then I went back outside and kept stacking, because winter was coming. And out here, winter doesn't care about your covenants, your committees, or your manicured fingernails. Winter only respects preparation. And I had no intention of meeting it empty-handed. The first real snow came the night Maggie turned 16. It started as a few lazy flakes drifting past the porch light, then thickened into a white curtain that swallowed sound itself. By midnight, the world outside was nothing but a soft, relentless roar. I stood at the kitchen window with a mug of coffee gone cold in my hand and watched the drifts climb the fence posts like slow-motion invaders. Maggie slept upstairs wrapped in the quilt her grandmother made the year before cancer took her. I could hear the faint whistle in her breathing through the old floorboards, nothing serious yet, just the dry air. But every whistle reminded me why the shed out back was more fortress than storage. The next morning, the county plow hadn't come within 5 miles of our road. The HOA had its own contractor, of course. Their orange trucks rumbled past the lower cul-de-sac, first blades throwing perfect arcs of snow onto lawns that would be green again by May. My driveway stayed virgin white. I fired up the old Ford chained up and carved my own path. When I came back, another glossy envelope waited under the wiper blade. Third notice. This one had color photos, my shed, my woodpile, my propane enclosure. Red circles drawn around each like targeting reticles. A new line had been added in bold. Failure to remedy within 72 hours will result in daily accruing fines and possible forced removal by authorized vendor. I carried it inside, laid it on the table next to the highlighted bylaws I'd printed at the library. No mention of firewood limits. No mention of propane enclosures. Only a vague sentence about preserving neighborhood aesthetics. I took a black Sharpie and drew a line through the word aesthetics, wrote above it in block letters, survival. Maggie came down in her pajamas, hair a wild halo, eyes still puffy from sleep. She saw the envelope and sighed the way only teenagers can sigh, half exasperation, half ancient weariness. They're not going to stop, are they? Not while Karen's breathing, I said. She poured herself cereal, then paused. Mrs. Delgado told Mom's old friend Lisa that Karen's husband lost a bundle in crypto last year. They need the HOA president title for the resume when they flip the big house in Phase 3. I raised an eyebrow. 16 years old and already better at intel than half the lieutenants I served with. That explains the desperation, I said. Doesn't excuse the crazy. Maggie crunched her cereal, thinking, what happens if we just ignore them? Then the fines stack up. They put a lien on the house. And eventually some judge who golfs with Karen's lawyer signs off on forced compliance. Happens all the time in places with stronger HOAs than ours. She looked out at the snow now glowing pink in the dawn. So we fight. We document, I corrected. Fighting comes later if it has to. That afternoon, I set up 2 trail cameras, one aimed at the shed, one at the porch, and ran the SD cards inside every night. I started a new folder on the laptop, HOA Evidence. 27 files already. I added number 28, a scanned copy of the third notice timestamped with a sticky note that read, "No such 72-hour clause exists in covenants." By the end of the week, the fines began. First email, 75. Second, 150 euro, escalated non-compliance. Third, 275, continued visual obstruction plus administrative processing. They came from a generic address admin@ridgeviewheightshoa.org with Karen's cursive electronic signature at the bottom like a royal seal. I printed every one 3-hole, punched them, slid them into the binder beside the bylaws. The total was already over $600 and climbing. Maggie watched me read the latest one and asked the question she'd been carrying for days. "Daddy, can they actually make us leave?" I set the paper down and looked her straight in the eye. "They can make noise. They can make paperwork. They can make our lives inconvenient as hell. But they cannot make us leave this house. This is ours. Paid for with blood and 22 years of sand in places sand was never meant to go, understand?" She nodded, but her eyes were older than 16. I pulled her into a hug that smelled of wood smoke and coffee. "We've survived worse than a woman with a clipboard and too much time." She laughed once, a small sound, then went quiet. "Because I need you to know," I said into her hair, "no matter what letters they tape to the door, no matter how many fines they dream up, this house stays warm and this table stays full. That's not negotiable." She squeezed me tighter. "Promise." Cross my heart and hope to freeze. That night, the temperature dropped to -12. The stove roared. The windows fogged and froze in fern patterns. I sat up late cleaning my grandfather's old Remington 700, oiling the bolt until it moved like water. Not because I expected to need it, because the ritual calmed me the way some men pray. At 2:14 a.m., the motion alert chimed on my phone. I slipped on boots and coat, grabbed the flashlight, and stepped into air so cold it felt like inhaling broken glass. The porch camera showed nothing but swirling snow. The shed camera showed the same. False alarm, probably a pine marten. But I stood there anyway, staring at my fortress of wood and steel glowing under the security light, and felt the first real thread of rage coil low in my gut. They weren't just harassing me. They were threatening the one thing I had left that was truly mine, the ability to keep my daughter alive when the world turned hostile. I went back inside, poured 2 fingers of bourbon I'd been saving since my retirement ceremony, and raised the glass to the dark window. "To Karen Stratton," I whispered, "may you never learn the hard way what happens when you push a man who's already decided there's nothing left to lose." Outside, the snow kept falling, erasing tire tracks, footprints, property lines. Inside, the fire crackled and the binder grew thicker. Winter had only just begun, and I was just getting started. The hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday at 6 sharp in the faux log community center that smelled of lemon disinfectant and desperation. I shaved for the first time in 10 days, pressed my old dress blues until the creases could cut bread, and pinned every ribbon I still owned across the left breast. Not for vanity, for intimidation. There's something about a chest full of brass that makes civilians remember rank exists for a reason. Maggie watched me knot the tie in the hallway mirror. "You look like you're going to a court-martial, Dad." "Same difference," I said. She bit her lip. "Kick her ass." Language, young lady. But yes, that's the plan. The parking lot was half full of Suburbans and Teslas, wearing fresh snow like expensive hats. I walked in through the side door so no one could pretend they didn't see me coming. Every head turned anyway. The folding tables had been arranged in a neat little tribunal. Karen sat dead center, flanked by Jeff the treasurer, balding, nervous, sweating through his golf shirt, and Meredith, the landscape chair, red hair, redder temper lips pressed so thin they disappeared. Name placards, bottled waters, a pitcher of cucumber slices floating like tiny green rafts. The whole production screamed authority that had never been tested by anything heavier than a strongly worded email. Karen stood when I entered. The smile was back, but colder now, like frost on a window pane. "Mr. Harlan, thank you for coming. Please have a seat." I didn't sit. I placed my binder on the table with a soft, deliberate thud that sounded louder than it should have. "Actually, I requested this hearing. You just approved it, so I'll stand." Jeff cleared his throat. Meredith glared. Karen's smile twitched. "Very well," she said, sitting again. "We're here to address your ongoing violations of community aesthetic standards." I opened the binder. First page, color photos of my shed, Taken from 4 angles, timestamped. Second page, the HOA bylaws, printed from the county website, highlighted in 3 colors. Third page, screenshots of Ridgeview Heights' own promotional brochure from 2 years ago, featuring a smiling couple in front of a house with, surprise, a very visible, very large woodpile. I turned the brochure so they could all see it. Funny, I said. When you were trying to sell lots, this was rustic Montana charm. Now that I live here, it's a violation. Meredith started to speak. I raised one finger polite, but the same finger I once used to silence a room full of lieutenants. I'm not finished. I walked them through every letter, every fine, every made-up clause. I read aloud the section that actually existed. Article 6, Section D, did not exist. I projected the county's official copy on the wall with the little projector I borrowed from the high school AV club, Maggie's idea. The room got very quiet. When I finished, Karen's knuckles were white around her pen. Thank you for that presentation, she said. However, the board has decided that a compromise is in everyone's best interest. She slid a single sheet across the table. Compromise. I could keep half the firewood if I built an HOA-approved privacy fence around the remainder. Design plans to be submitted for review within 10 days. $250 administrative impact fee payable immediately. I looked at the paper, then at her. Let me make sure I understand, I said, voice calm enough to freeze water. You want me to spend thousands of dollars and several weeks of labor hiding perfectly legal firewood behind a wall you get to approve during the onset of winter because you don't like looking at my survival. Karen leaned forward. We're offering you a path forward, Mr. Harlan. I closed the binder. Go to hell, Karen. The room inhaled as one organism. I picked up my cover, turned on my heel, and walked out. The cold night air hit my face like a slap I welcomed. On my way across the parking lot, a young woman stepped out of the shadows beside the dumpsters. Early 30s, dark ponytail, paint-stained hoodie. She glanced over her shoulder like someone might be watching. You're not the only one, she whispered. I stopped. Come again. She hugged a manila folder to her chest. They fined me $600 for painting my porch coastal fog. Said it wasn't in the approved palette. Same exact paint is on Karen's own house. I've got photos. I handed her my card, simple white stock name and cell number only. Document everything, dates, amounts, emails. You're going to need a trail when this gets ugly. She took the card with shaking fingers. It's already ugly. Then make it uglier for them, I said. They only win if we stay quiet. She disappeared back into the dark. I stood there a moment longer, breath fogging under the security light, feeling the first real spark of something that wasn't rage. It was solidarity. And solidarity in a place like this is the most dangerous weapon of all. 2 nights after the hearing, the temperature dove to -22. The kind of cold that makes diesel gel and turns breath into needles. I was up at 3:07 a.m. because the stove had burned low and Maggie's cough had moved from her throat to her chest. I fed it the last 3 splits of pine, watched the flames climb,